big business now is increasingly understanding this. And so, again, I say a year ago, if the mainstream audience in many cases thought the XR were exaggerating for effect, when they woke up in the early part of the new year to see Australia on fire, they began to perhaps question that. I think Australia has been the biggest wake-up call one could possibly imagine. It's realising, accepting the problem is real, it's huge, it ain't going to go away, so therefore at least try. Which is why, I think in a business sense, innovation can really help us here.
You're listening to the Spaceship Earth podcast with me, Dan Burgess.
Thanks for tuning in. Welcome to the show. This is episode 31 of the Spaceship Earth podcast. In this episode, I'm in conversation with Sean Pillot De Chennecy.
So what's this podcast all about? Well, the concept of the Spaceship Earth is simple. We live on a life-giving rock called Earth, hurtling through space. Like a spaceship, we have a finite amount of supplies and an intelligent operating system, which keeps everything replenished as long as we all respect it and use it wisely. So an understanding of how this system works, along with deep cooperation between humans and all life, is essential to keep us and the spaceship flying. Someone awesome once said, "There are no passengers on Spaceship Earth, we are all crew." So in this podcast, I'm having conversations with folks who are responding to the design principles of Spaceship Earth, involved in restoring and regenerating, raising awareness and consciousness, and reimagining how we can live more beautifully through creativity, care, ideas, collaborations, community, new forms of business, and more. I talk to artists, photographers, entrepreneurs, writers, designers, strategists, activists, adventurers, healers, creative mavericks, and more. I believe their stories can inspire all of us to become more planetary, to fully participate as crew on the Spaceship Earth.
Thanks for tuning in. Welcome to the show. This is episode 31 of the Spaceship Earth podcast. In this episode, I'm in conversation with Sean Pillot De Chennecy. Sean is an author, having released, well, he's got his second book coming out any day. It might already be out by the time I put this out. His first book was called The Post-Truth Business. Very, very relevant right now. How to rebuild brand authenticity in a distrusting world. Released a couple of years ago. Well worth a read. You know, because what is true anymore and what isn't, I have no idea, as we discover and explore a lot in this session. And Sean's new book, his latest book, is called Influencers and Revolutionaries: How Innovative Trailblazers, Trends and Catalysts Are Transforming Business. So a bit of a business vibe. Sean has very good pedigree. He's been someone who has been kind of researching the future, trends, insight, always on the bleeding edge of what is unfolding. Pretty much all his professional life. He's still an active researcher, strategist, works with lots of businesses and agencies around the world. And he's obviously now a cracking author and speaker. So, we get into a lot in this. It was a big conversation. And we went fairly deep and jumped into some fairly interesting dimensions. So I want a quick shout out to the folks at Bountiful Cow who gave me space to record this one, and the very lovely Graham Douglas. Thank you for that little space. This is a new theme for 2020. I'm sort of popping up in London and other cities, and on the hoof. Can I get a space for a cheeky podcast conversation? So, more of that, please. Marvellous. Lots very lovely people out there. You just got to ask. You know, this is a step to living in the gift, you know, when we all offer something out to the world that we can. So thanks to those guys for giving us the space for this conversation. As ever, if you are loving this show or enjoying it, please do share it. If you like what you're hearing, give us a rating or a review, Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you're listening to. It's bloody useful because it surfaces the show to others who might be sort of thinking they need to listen to this show, but they haven't quite worked out it's there. So it will take you a few seconds and it'd be much appreciated. So a little cheeky rating, a little cheeky share, it all helps. Okay, let's get to it. This is episode 31 of the Spaceship Earth podcast with Sean Pillot De Chennecy. Sean, welcome to the Spaceship Earth podcast.
Dan, very nice to be here on this, has to be said, rather grey day.
I know. I've been. This is moving around London this week. I've gone from a spot to spot, generously being gifted by the power of sort of putting stuff out on Twitter. So this could be a new behaviour for this podcast. Gets me out of the shed in Bath. But thanks so much for getting saying yes to this. I've been really up for talking for a while. I want to get in. I mean, you've got a new book coming out. You've got a book that I really want to talk about, which came out, was it a couple of years now?
Yeah.
So, you're a writer, you're a researcher, strategist, speaker. I thought before we got stuck into the post-truth thing, I just thought it was, for me, I mean, obviously there's a whole story of how this, I'd love to know a little bit about how this thing was birthed, like what led you to this post-truth. But it was just interesting this morning as I was doing a little bit of prep. I just kind of looked at a couple of my feeds, and I think there was a few things instantly popping up. So it was like there was something around the younger Murdochs, James Murdoch, sort of there was something about him, challenging News Corp for their kind of silence around the kind of climate change and all the fires in Australia. And then I sort of scrolled down again. I saw a report from I think it was Avaz about YouTube serving up loads and loads of kind of quite big global brand ads on the back of kind of climate denying sort of content. Scroll down again, and there was something on our new minister, health minister, Matt Hancock, on BBC this morning, saying that actually we shouldn't fly less, we should keep flying domestically, and aviation has been decarbonised, and electric planes are really not that far off in the future. As far as I'm concerned, that's all nonsense. And so it just feels like we're in this time where, this book that you brought out, The Post-Truth Business, which was exploring, a lot of this kind of stuff. We'll get to today, but give us a bit of context to where this came from. What was how did it come to sort of birth into the world?
All right. So, so basically, to be really specific about the book, as opposed to just talking about sort of a sort of random sort of life history, which would be fascinating to myself but to nobody else. So the book came out summer of 2018, so launched it at the Byline Festival a couple of years ago, and when obviously people like the wonderful Carol Cadwallader was speaking, and she'd just done the expose via The Guardian, which obviously linked up with the New York Times and the Washington Post about Cambridge Analytica and all the rest of it. And then Chris Wiley was talking as well, because obviously he was the one that had really was the sort of the turncoat at thank God at CA, and has said this is what's going on. There's also a lot of talk there about the subversion that was going on with regards to the Brexit vote. Anyway, so coming back from why it launched there and why I wrote it. So go back a couple of years to 2016, and we've been going through the obviously the electioneering, the US presidential elections, obviously when Trump was taking on Hillary Clinton, and during that, because I give speeches all the time, and I'm sure I know, having listened to loads of your podcasts, they're always fantastic. And just to be a speaker and an author is quite frankly nothing at all unusual, because obviously there are lots out there. But what I found fascinating when I was giving a talk, I was in the Middle East, and I was on a platform with a guy called David Plouffe, who had been Obama's campaign chief, and he gave a really interesting talk about, and the point of his talk was how they had done the great campaign they did for Obama's second campaign. Okay, so you and I would imagine the majority of your sort of podcast listeners would be fans of the wonderful Obama, and I think a lot of people, in terms of the received wisdom of this, people thought, great first black president of America. Isn't it wonderful to have him there? This is a brave new world. Absolutely fantastic. Hugely progressive move. Forgetting that about half of America hated him. And, in terms of the second Obama presidency, he got in by something like, 52 to 48%. So, again, people like you and I perhaps were going, again, fantastic, great, again, another progressive move. just not realizing that there was this seething resentment against him and everything he stood for. Anyway, so David Plouffe then gave a talk on how they had organized the campaign. It was a really grassroots-led campaign that had got him, really sort of propelled him into the White House. And as part of that, they had been leveraging what was still at that point a reasonably new world of giant tech platforms and the social media sort of titans of Silicon Valley. So again, it's always worth reminding people to state the obvious that these are still early days in that world. A decade ago, the landscape was very, very different, let alone 2 decades ago. For instance, when I first worked in advertising, when they just didn't exist. So David Plouffe gave this talk on how they basically had run the campaign. One of the points he made was that they had basically scraped as much data as they could from Facebook and used that in order to hyper-target individuals around the States. And we'll talk more about perhaps advertising later, how that's all being done. So meanwhile, us in the audience, bunch of agency people and all the rest of it, and marketeers, all going, isn't that fantastic? Because one of the results of that is that we got Obama. We then found, then I was talking to David afterwards, and I was going, so what do you think is going to happen now in terms of the Trump-Clinton electioneering? He's going, Trump will win. Because, again, he's using the same tactics that we used, but it's moved on even in the short time since we did it, and he's really going for it. And we then saw, as we know, the Trump campaign ran, I think, just over 6.5 million individual ads, hyper-targeting people across the states, compared to Hillary Clinton that ran slightly under 70,000. So he spectacularly destroyed her in terms of the usage and the leverage of the social media platforms. At that point, again, there's a lot of people like Zherkov, the puppet master in Russia that sits behind Putin, that works alongside Putin, that plays around with society as though society is a theatre and as though people are actors to be moved, and you can pull various levers and things happen. The issue there of the destabilization of the social media networks was beginning to be the word was beginning to get out in terms of one of the great points of social media was that it was totally open. Anyone can get involved. We look back now in a few years to all those statements about, isn't it wonderful when everyone can make their political voice heard? What a great move for democracy.
Yeah, I mean, I even just remember like the early days of Twitter when it was just really pleasant. People just sort of like this idea that you could connect with all these different sort of thoughts and ideas and sharing learnings, and it was actually generally quite a brilliant. I remember it right at the start. I remember I was like 60,000 something to sign up to, and I remember this whole in the sort of strategy kind of networks of in agencies. It was a really, people were playing a lot with it and saying, "Wow, this is a really interesting thing." It's opening up the ability to kind of share these ideas, to kind of get access to different ways of thinking about the world, and there was this really kind of generous sort of openness going on. And now, obviously, now, Twitter, you've got like strap your kind of like armory on to get, on. It's a completely different game.
Yeah. It's a bit like that comment and a different thing. I remember, not that I'm a massive Banksy fan, but I did remember that he made that great comment during the film Exit Through the Gift Shop, because I'm old friends with Steve Lazarides, obviously, very much part of that world. And at one point, and they're looking at the appalling Mr. Brainwash, and all those artists that came out that basically were just mimicking, obviously, whatever was going on in terms of street art and doing like a fairly ersatz version of it, which a lot of people couldn't tell the difference, and so they bought it anyway. And, Banksy was saying that, we used to be told that everyone's creativity should be heard. You can actually perhaps not. And so the same thing with political voices. And obviously, where we then got to fairly quickly was the mentalists took over, and anyone with a completely sort of a vaguely, should we say, normal, liberal with a small L, reasonable, considered point of view was just shouted down. And where we are now, as we know, is just a Twitter sphere that's just full of ranting maniacs on the far left and the far right, with everyone else just crowded out. So, to go back a bit, as this whole thing began to go in 2016, when the word beginning to get out, and it's just odd in that you could see that something wasn't right, and it was it was just bizarre how the accepted norms of behaviour in terms of politicians not lying, and when they do, they're called out, big time, that, if you like, we're used to. We're fully aware that politicians obviously bend the truth and wear propaganda and all of that, but just blank, straight out, spectacular, consistent lying is just something that we just didn't associate with political discourse. And obviously, again, in terms of sort of bias, I think Trump's had a dreadful impact on the world. But it was extraordinary how he was just getting away with it. And so, meanwhile, we're back in brand world, we're told that, there's been a spectacular decline of trust in brands. And I always use the old saying that, as The Economist said back in the early 2000s, trust is the basis of all brand values. And that's why businesses of all types have got a sort of massive incentive to retain trust, particularly in an environment. And this is crucial, particularly in an environment where there is choice. And so if we can accept that since the early 80s there's been an explosion of choice in every sector, or just about every sector, then one of the key points when you're looking at things like reputation capital, which I write about a lot in terms of is a brand or organization, I don't mind this as a politician or an airline or a chocolate brand, whatever, if they're not trustworthy, reliable and competent, then when choice is available, you will go elsewhere. So yesterday is announced, for instance, that Boeing, after all the 737 Maxes falling out of the air and killing everyone, Boeing are now just losing money to an astonishing degree compared to people like Airbus, because choice is available and the recipients of those planes are going, actually, our passengers don't want to fly on your plane, thanks. So that's a classic example of trust destroying a brand at speed. Meanwhile, the one brand that obviously got away with this in many ways were the one that that was being blamed for it all in terms of the anti-social network Facebook, that because Zuckerberg had been buying up the hinterland all around them, there was no choice effectively. So we saw that come a couple of years later, the expose, what had been up to, the issues of Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, of which we all know what's going on there. Is that there was the hashtag delete Facebook campaign, which about 5 people did. And I was one of them, and then found out that you've basically lost touch with all of your school friends. So where do you go? So one of those. So therefore, it became a completely self-defeating thing. Although it's very nice to be off it. Anyway, so I saw this going on, and I remember seeing. I was giving another speech, and I saw there's a Time magazine ad, I think, that said, is truth dead? That mimicked an old ad they'd had in the 60s, the John Lennon saying, which was, is God dead? When he said, Beatles were more famous than God or whatever, which caused outrage at the time. And I remember, I was trawling around, obviously on Amazon and going to Barnes and Noble and wherever, and then Waterston's back here, and saying, what have you got? What books have you got on truth from a brand, from a business point of view? And again, we've got loads in it in terms of social based trust, and we've got loads on this from a political viewpoint, but nothing on business. I was going, you must have. Soon realised nobody had written the most obvious book in the world, which basically linked up truth, trust, transparency, privacy. Then things like disinformation and all the rest of it, and how it impacts business. So, with a sense of rising panic, I wrote it as fast as I could, thinking any day now someone's going to drop. They're going to be like, that there's like a million books on disruption or innovation, And so I thought, oh my God, this is so obvious. Everyone's going to be writing it as I am, and luckily they didn't.
Amazing. How long did it take you to get it out?
Half an hour. 6 months of, or maybe a bit more, 8 months of, just completely took my sort of life over. And like all these things, the biggest thing I found with it was, trying not to repeat yourself constantly while tying these whole issues together. Also, another big thing was privacy. Again, nobody was talking about privacy a couple of years ago. It just wasn't on the map in terms of mainstream audiences. So I was writing this when I was giving talks at events when literally people go, what are you on about? And I was going, and then as I began to finish it off, I began, the tech conferences I was speaking at, began to meet a few of the startups who were going, right, where it's all going is monetized privacy. So, people realizing their data has value, and therefore effectively brands can rent it for them from a price, which is now totally obvious. But back in 2017 when I was writing it, it wasn't.
Yeah.
So it was just a case of writing it because I just got obsessed with it.
Yeah. And I mean, this element of this trust topic, though. I mean, it's pretty immense, right? I mean, if you sort of strip it away from business for a minute and just as a human thing,
Yeah.
you know, it's. I mean, I find it completely nuts. You know, as a parent and watching young teenagers sort of growing up in this kind of whole thing where, as far as I can tell, I look at my son, he's like, he thinks the whole political thing, you know, it's just a joke. It's like there's no, I mean, I know we've always, as youngsters, kind of dissed power and whatever, but to the degree that it's now, you know, I don't know, I just think, you know, this whole erosion that's going on, then what do you trust and how do you build trust? And, you know, these big questions, can society sort of evolve, you know, how can it evolve with, you know, if the sense of trust has been so devalued, how do we bring that back? And, you know, it forms the basis almost of anything good to happen needs a sort of sense of trust around it, right? Or there's and so I'm sort of, you know, as I say, I mentioned that stuff at the start today because, again, just it feels like now we're in this, you know, as you talked about, the post-truth world, right? And we're in this world. And as far as I say, you know, we've got a recently elected minister just blatantly lying on national radio.
Yeah, yeah.
And no one's challenging that. You're just kind of like, well, how do we, you know, what have you've obviously learned so much through this journey, but are you getting some clues as to where, is it getting worse since the book's published? Or
well, I think one of the key things is to realise that this isn't happening by accident. I'm a very, very great believer in the fact that the sort of intelligence networks have been doing this deliberately, and particularly foreign networks like the Russian intelligence. So the issues of them deliberately playing around with society, I mentioned the whole thing about Zherkov, the puppet master, and playing with social trust in a way that the key point is that they're not trying to get you to believe any particular thing. What they're wanting you to believe is there's no such thing as truth. And they want you to believe that everyone's lying, that all politicians are useless, and that basically it's everyone for themselves. If you go back to what happened in the Soviet Union when basically things fell apart after Gorbachev, then you can see how it was anarchy over there, and the viewpoint was that, so I think from a Western point of view, we've won the whole, you know, famous sort of, Francis Fukuyama thing about, you know, the end of history. Liberal democracy is won because it's evidently at that point late 80s, the way to go. And obviously, it wasn't the end of history, to put it mildly. And the intelligence networks were very clearly not giving up. It wasn't as though they all got something else to do. They got a different job. The idea was keep on pushing the disinformation, the misinformation, keep on destabilizing. And they saw very much that things like the social networks were a huge open goal. When we were running around going, it's brilliant, you just put all your info on there and then you can track down whoever you like, your best mate from school from 20 years ago, and, you know, don't bother with passwords or just call them after the most obvious thing in the world, 1, 2, 3, 4. They'll never think of that, But fast forward to where we are now, and these issues of playing around with society are very much being done deliberately. And same thing, obviously, with the Chinese military or the Chinese intelligence. So. And then you look into things like what's happening with the erosion of privacy, and it's all a fairly horrible mix. Meanwhile, there is an absolute social need for trust. There is, and this, endless books on this. Rachel Botsman's book is always quoted. It's fantastic. She's a brilliant writer. So that notion of, every human relationship, absolutely rests on trust, or things fall apart. It's a relationship you have with your partner, or you have with your politician of choice, or you have with your brand of choice, etc., etc. It's why I go back to this simple equation that I talk about, which I made up this term as I was walking along, reputation capital, which is to say all about you can judge anyone, any brand of any type, in any sector on are they trustworthy, reliable and competent. You can look back to before Christmas, the UK election. You can think, right, what was the choice between, for instance, Corbyn and Johnson? And no matter which side of the political spectrum you're from, I think, let's say if you're broadly straddling the centre, which, again, most people traditionally in the UK have been, then you could say, was the choice between someone like Corbyn, who appeared to be entirely trustworthy because he really did say what he meant and all the rest of it, but was he competent, reliable? Possibly yes, possibly not. Meanwhile, Boris Johnson, Was he trustworthy? I would argue absolutely not. Was he competent? Oh, yeah. And reliable? Vaguely. And so there's your awful choice. I think for most people, do you want the useless one or the competent one? Do you want the liar or the one telling the truth? And unfortunately, the good things didn't all go into one side of that. So hence all those thoughts when people looked at the various sort of speaker panels and the politicians, and it was, is this really what the choice is? Yeah. So one of those. So so I think in terms of, so is there a good story at the end of all this? I think yes. So it's as we know, okay, there's been, let's say, looking at the media, huge decline in trust in the media generally. Meanwhile, big rise in trust in individual journalists. So we could say, when it comes to you or I thinking, what am I going to believe? Then it may well be that you may well be someone who believes everything that George Monbiot says, or not, or you may be everyone that believes that I know David Aranovich says, or Carol Cadwallader, or whatever. These sort of, if you like, the star journalists tend to have very devoted followings, and I think with the best will in the world, if something like, Aranovich is saying it consistently, if Cadwallader is saying it consistently, yes, you will not believe it slavishly, but you think, what, I respect their opinions. They're not lying. They might get it wrong occasionally, as anyone does, but I believe they come from a good place. It's why things like the New York Times is now having and the Guardian are having the fastest rising levels of subscription they've ever had. It's because people are desperate for something they can rely on, and they're thinking, you know what? Again, occasionally they'll get it wrong, but broadly speaking, they're coming from a decent place.
Is that still working on the other end of the spectrum though as well? Like the journalists who represent a completely different view. There's still sort of power in.
There is very much so, unfortunately. So you've got things like now that he's been sort of thankfully sort of stamped on slightly, but the whole InfoWars thing, the whole echo chamber thing is very, very obviously which really got going during the 2016 elections in terms of, again, because it just linked into that time when the networks were really exploding in size.
And I guess that's that shift in how we as modern humans sort of make sense of our world through the news system, the news that we get, and the system, the platform that we use, right?
Sure,
so
and
that's the big thing, right?
And that's the big problem.
Your worldview is being shaped potentially by a platform versus a more of open way of accessing information. You're locked into WhatsApp or Facebook or whatever.
Exactly. That's the great problem, obviously, when again, it's what people like Trump have realised, is that you don't need to go through the mainstream media. It's what Johnson's doing now, when he's just, for instance, 5 years ago, Newsnight, bestrode the world like a colossus. You could say Newsnight now is a sort of shadow of its former self, when it's, it's in terms of the decline in its power and its ability to hold the powerful to account. So these people are realising that they don't have to go through accepted media channels. They just won't talk to journalists. They'll talk to their favoured journalists, or just, as Trump will do, will just broadcast outwards from his bed while eating 5 hamburgers via Twitter. There's a thing, wasn't it, 2 weeks ago,
still completely surreal now, isn't he?
Utterly. Well, then yesterday about him talking about washing machines when he was doing his mad rant at one of these rallies. The whole thing, 10 days ago after, when the Iranian crisis really blew up, when the latest version of it blew up, and when he was just, announced via Twitter from his bed, just gave the note saying, Congress, take this as read, that, if the Iranians do anything, we will hit them harder than they've ever been. It's like, sorry, so is America being run by Twitter now? And also someone saying brilliantly, actually, in terms of Twitter's code of conduct, does declaring war on another country actually go against it?
So let's get into the kind of brand stuff, that what you learn. So seeing this shift that's been going on, this post-truth world where we're sort of like, authenticity is bombed. No one really knows what the hell's going on. What were you dug quite a lot into the world of brands and business and advertising and how we're communicating and all that. So tell us a sort of just senses of what's really came out of who's really suffering right now, and who are the folks that are kind of responding well to this, and what are they doing?
Okay, well, I think the interesting thing is that certainly Adland is so spectacularly shafted, it's unbelievable. the decline of advertising is long foretold. I mean, endlessly, we've been told advertising is all over, and yet miraculously, like capitalism itself, it always manages to sort of, replicate or whatever, like something out of sort of a Schwarzenegger film. So I think Adland has got real problems. You go into an agency now, and there's a sense of desperation. It's like the fall of Saigon. They're all just like burning all the files, and will the helicopter be on the roof to sort of pick them up before the mob arrives? So I think Adland's a really, really bad place to be. I think the business models are bad. I think it's a very unhappy industry. I think they're all spectacularly overworked. There's too much to do because, as they say, all the world's a screen. The work never finishes. It's just out of control, and I think it's generally just it ain't happening. If ever a sector has a lower hit rate than advertising, God, I'd like to know what it is. There's the occasional blip when they do something amusing that we all like and may repeat, which they talk about endlessly at Cannes Lion, but meanwhile, the hit rate is so low, it's spectacular.
And advertising, in truth, right, has always been a slightly dubious kind of...
very much so, of course. The whole point is, in terms of the billion-dollar persuasion machine, has always been, twist it as much as you can, because, as we know, there's classic things, as everyone repeats. Any one of your listeners could give exactly the same sort of response now of genuine brand differentiation is minimal. On a sort of, again, on a functional level, blah, blah, blah. It's just the products are all well designed and well made, and the design thinking thing has gone into, within a reason, just about everything. Very hard to buy something now that basically doesn't do what it says in the tin. So therefore, it's all about branding, as opposed to the received wisdom goes in the agencies, as opposed to the functional truth. Meanwhile, how do they actually get any sort of a real sense of differentiation there? And which are the ones that are really punching their weight? Everyone always goes to the natural brand that they all talk about in terms of who does it well, Patagonia, as you're wearing today. The mighty Patagonia obviously are utterly wonderful, and just good luck to them. The ones that I think people tend to then go to very quickly after that are the niche brand of choice, becoming ever more local and human, and that alongside your sort of functional things that make your life easier, that sort of smooth the way. And obviously tech does a huge amount of that. The more human-faced brands are the ones that you and I love, that will have a human aspect to them. Hence, lots of talks about humane capitalism and all the rest. Meanwhile, you have an ad industry that just doesn't link really to this, because it's difficult to leverage all that properly. You've got an advertising trade press that is so just imbecilically out of date. It's remarkable. I think it's all very
and it's kind of like it's this whole thing. So it strikes me again and it's sort of connected to this kind of what is real and what isn't in our world. Because if we see we've witnessed these big companies and brands growing and getting bigger and bigger and showing, that's so pervasive in our lives. But actually, as you start to sort of see the reality of the world, you see the kind of our sort of stories of the world maybe starting to fall apart around us.
Totally.
Then for me, also, it's just the advertising always just feels it feels more and more uncomfortable, because it feels more like, well, we know that the reality is different. So even a few years back, you could sort of see why advertising was still kind of doing its thing.
Yeah.
But as the reality that most of us are living, whether it's the fact that we realise that, living in a city is pretty hellish, the air's polluted, there's litter and rubbish everywhere, we've got oceans filled out with plastic, there's all these things going on, but still we're getting these messages of kind of like, be this, be that, buy that, become this. It becomes, I think the myth just becomes... It becomes so ridiculous almost.
Completely. I remember back in, in the whatever, let's say sort of from the sort of early 90s, at that point I was working in youth culture, and so I used to sort of write for a few of the magazines, and again, small world, we all knew each other, the whole, Days lot and the Sleaze Nation lot and the Jockey slot and the G spots and all of that, and so I remember, for instance, let's say my sort of real Damascene conversion was sort of late 90s. I was on the J18 protest. It was the first big sort of reclaim the streets, sort of stop the city thing. This is before Seattle and all of that. Yeah. And I was interviewing people there on the streets, and I found it really interesting that you had it's probably about 5,000 people there, and it's done by the stock exchange, and from all walks of life, all ages, and of the 5,000 people, there are probably about, I don't know, let's say 50 to 100 masked anarchists, as the Daily Mail will put it, and they trashed a McDonald's, obviously, in a Mercedes showroom. And the next day, the press was just full of, basically saying, anarchists attack the city, terrified women and children running for their lives. Nothing could have been further from the truth. And what I also found fascinating was the people I was interviewing very coherently just saying, you know what, capitalism's out of control, planet's beginning to fall apart, we need to be doing something about this, there is a different way. And there were no journalists there at all interviewing people, just a few photographers taking a few shots, and that was it. So I used to go on the Gideon Coe show once in a while, who's now, Radio 6 and other DJs on at what used to be GLR. Remember that? So I'm going on there and just talking about this. This is really important, and it's really odd because I spent the last 10 years specialising in youth culture, where broadly speaking, everything's been very positive, and everything has been put forward from the point of view of effectively what's cool and what's the next big thing. And suddenly, here's a bunch of people saying this whole thing is out of control. You've got to stop what you're doing. This isn't working anymore. And that coincided with the campaign I was working on at the time in a very small way, which I cover off in the book, called the Truth Campaign. And that was the agency I was working with. We're working with the Chris and Porter Bogusky in Miami, the great Chris and Porter, and another couple of agencies in the Midwest on the American government's anti-tobacco campaign. And that was based around telling the truth and just saying, you know what, there's no point if you're facing a really giant problem, and at that point, let's say, as we know, smoking kills 1 in 3 users. Philip Morris and the rest of them are killing more people every week than, fast forward to now, than ISIS and Al Qaeda have done in 20 years. So basically, in order to protect Americans, the American Air Force should be bombing Philip Morris factories every week, and that would save a lot more Americans than it would to actually sort of, trying to take out other sort of particular sort of terrorist groups. Although obviously you should take them out as well. So it was that those two things happened at the same time. I thought this is just bonkers. So I just jumped out of agency world and set up. My wife was at the BBC, so we set up together, and we spent a lot of time. I was just doing straight qualitative work, and then also just a lot of talking about sort of ethical issues, which are now so obvious they go without saying. But at that point, no one really was. But then you fast forward to things like the sort of say things like the sort of Stop the City movement, sort of reclaim the streets. Then obviously things like Rising Up. You've got the whole things like the group that only really had any real. That brought about any real change with the Uncut movement in terms of the holding the Starbucks and the Apples of the world, in terms of not paying their taxes. And I think only today or yesterday it was announced that I think Shell didn't pay any tax at all last year. Wow. Not a penny. Thanks for that. And there's a great comment from XR kind of going, wow, not only have they wrecking the planet, they don't even pay any tax. Thanks for that. But then obviously fast forward to now, and then fast forward to 18 months ago when I was beginning to finish off post-truth business, and then I noticed that which I covered off in the book, obviously, as one would do naturally, the whole issues about the circular economy and the rest of it and sustainability were all obviously in there, but I was really focused on the truth aspect. And I thought, you know what, no one has written a book about how vital it is, underlined in capital letters, that all businesses of every type get their heads right around the issue in terms of where it's going of things like the climate crisis. So I began to write the next book. And then that's out in about 2 weeks' time. And just as the first book, just the timing of it, it was the first one. And I say it sounds like a boast, but it's not. It's just I think it's a fact. I challenge anyone to prove me wrong. It was the first one to say that linked truth, trust, transparency, blah blah blah. It's a business. This one, I think, is going to be the first business book that just connects this issue of I say innovation in particular, where business is going, is linked obviously in the two big things. One is sort of tech, naturally, and the other one is climate crisis. And I don't think anyone's. Obviously, I hope there can be 100 books out next week about it. There should be. But I think I'm in there very early, just because it was happening while I was writing it. So the first XR demos were happening as I was writing it. Obviously, Greta Thunberg, she began to get going obviously at the same time. And she's now, I think it's interesting how she's very rightly the people's champion, there's also some danger in there of, it's unfair to her to put it all on her shoulders, obviously. So obviously enormous pressure there must be on her, to put it mildly, to state the staggeringly obvious. And you're concerned for someone like that is just set up to fail, because obviously there's so many journalists that would just love, it's like, oh, Greta, did you come here by car today?
Yeah, right,
or did you walk here? Do you swim across the North Sea?
Nonsense of I mean, this whole idea, we've talked about this quite a bit, in this whole, just we're all implicated, right? The system is so pervasive, we can't, we're all hypocrites like that. But let's start from that point and go on, rather than trying to sort of tear each other down for eating the old burger or getting on a flight, because we're never going to get anywhere otherwise. But there's this, just before we sort of launch into this climate piece, because so. For me, I'm thinking, look at this post-truth thing. So what I'm really curious and actually just exploring a lot in my work at the moment, but again, how, if we go back to businesses and brands, let's say, I mean, politicians is another thing, but how, we're in this crisis, and my sense is that people are either in denial. I mean, as I read this thing that Nick Cohen wrote about these 3 stages of denial, but you're either sort of currently... if you're kind of leading a business right now, you're effectively probably either sort of in denial, or you're accepting that something massive is going on, right? You're accepting that this system, this model we've been pursuing, is bust, and the meltdown in climate and ecosystems is just the symptom of an economic idea that's just it's out of date. It's got to go, right? If we want to maintain life on this planet. And so how do you showing up honestly and with sort of trust and authenticity in this thing, being able to kind of step into this new space of, we have a foot in a camp which still wants growth and shareholder returns and new business wins if you're an agency or whatever it might be. But at the same time, you have more folks who are clearly waking up. They clearly are, more, we're humans, we can sense as well, right? But the evidence is all around us. So, I mean, Nick Cohen talks about this thing. He wrote this thing actually a couple of weeks ago. He was saying that there's this refusal to admit, and then there's this kind of sense of maybe there's this kind of bump in the road thing that you're acknowledging. And then it's sort of down the line, the third step is admitting, but it's too late. So it's because, but I'm just sort of curious how, what's your thoughts, and maybe that's into the new book. But again, who is stepping into this? What is it how can we hold both of these kind of quite uncomfortable truths, I guess, or how do we shift from this one way of seeing the world? And particularly, I'm interested in the sort of brands and business, because we know the pressures and I'm also interested, you've built, people have built their identities and their careers, and their whole world views often are shaped by this journey they've been on.
Yeah,
and
totally.
It's being challenged now.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious how, with the truth, increasingly, well, I guess depends which side you sit on, but becoming very, very hard to avoid this reality. What is it that's going to start shifting these companies, and who are, what's your sense, or have you been exploring that at all through?
Yeah. I mean, I was talking about this the other day. I was over at XR on Monday, talking to Will, who I know has been on, and Gail Bradbrook and some of the team, and it's just I was pointed to this very good article in the latest issue of Dumbo Feather, the Australian magazine. It's great, and they talk about this from the point of view of, and obviously it's ironic and the weakest use of that word, because obviously now I think one of the key things is, a year ago a mainstream audience thought, quite frankly, that XR were really exaggerating this, and they, again, people tend to dismiss groups like this as being either just a bunch of sort of irritating people from Dalston or Williamsburg, or they're sort of a bunch of sort of annoying students who are just this year's students. What are this year's students angry about? They'll soon go away and get a proper job. Or are they just a bunch of slightly odd hippies, or they just, are they sort of a privileged middle class that can afford to be annoyed about something? And there's always been obviously that other angle, which is the environmental movement itself has always been very linked into a middle class point of view, because they can afford to be concerned about it, and they can afford to lecture everyone else on eating organically, etc., etc. So there are clear weaknesses to the movement that the Daily Mails of the world just latch on each time. And he's talking earlier on about this purist thing is a real problem. Roger Hallam talks about this. If they only allowed people to be involved with Extinction Rebellion who led pure lives, there'd be 3 of them,
right,
and they'd be arguing in a pub. Right. You've got to have it, as you completely clearly says with Gail Bradbrook, who I think is the real brains behind it, you got to have everyone involved. Everyone's welcome. Everyone can do something and be active, and it's linking that and clarifying it and enabling that, which is vital, which is why people like Patagonia through their active site does it very well, saying whatever you're into, let us know, we'll try and match you with someone who has a similar interest, blah blah blah. Okay. But in terms of the brand piece, I think it's fascinating. We talked earlier on about this, and our kids, our teenage kids, how I was saying, to me it's very fascinating that if you've got teenage kids, when they were at primary school, they were being taught about this. So it's really interesting to me that you've got that generation coming through, and generally speaking, I can't stand generational marketing stuff. I think it's all crap, it's just very easy to do, it's very weak. But with things like that, it's really interesting. You talk to someone now who is 17, 18 or below, and they just get it. They don't question it. They don't doubt it. They just go, yeah, we know what the science is. We can clearly see what's happening. We know something has to be done. They're not massive, out of control consumerists. Obviously, they like looking good, as everyone does, but they're not. They don't have that sort of obsession or me thing, I think, which is really fascinating on a branded sort of, on the branded individual sense. So, is there light in the tunnel? Yes, I think there is, and it's interesting how, again, obviously next week Davos, I was going to be going, and yesterday I found out I'm not, tragically. But there's I think big business now is increasingly understanding this, and so again, I say a year ago, if the mainstream audience in many cases thought the XR were exaggerating for effect, when they woke up in the early part of the new year to see Australia on fire, they began to perhaps question that. I think Australia has been the biggest wake-up call one could possibly imagine. And I think, interestingly, it's the site of horrendously, just horrendous amounts of dead animals that were burnt alive. Has just horrified people. Absolutely horrified. And more than seeing, I think we're so used now, it's an appalling thing to say, I think we're so inured to seeing people clinging to the roofs of houses or huts with rising waters around them every night on the news. I think a lot of people have grown almost immune. It sounds bizarre to say it. It's an appalling thing to say, I know. I think a lot of people have grown almost immune to the daily diet of bad
it's like
news
a
and
coping
stuff.
mechanism almost, isn't it?
But I think when people start seeing animals suffering, I think it's really odd how the emotive trigger, just as we saw a couple of years ago, that when the appalling photograph of the toddler that had been drowned in an immigrant boat coming across from Libya or something, and I think about 20 foot away there are a couple enjoying their cocktail on a beach, and everyone's going, "Wow, is that really who we are?"
Yeah.
I think so. I think Australia has appallingly, unfortunately, proven to the skeptics that actually XR weren't exaggerating. I think a problem last year, has to be said, was that Greta Thunberg in particular was getting so strident, and it's interesting how that voice has been obviously, she's toned it down a bit. When it began to be so apocalyptic, it was a case of, like, it's over. It actually, quite frankly, if we don't do anything like this afternoon, then we might as well give up, at which point most people thought, well, if it's that bad, then let's get the drinks in, because, and do nothing, and let's burn some plastic in the garden. People need to have a viewpoint that believe the science, tell the truth, as they say, and then in this particularly well-written piece I read the other day from that my wife found in Dumbo Feather, talking about the two types of optimism, the two types of skepticism. It is the active skeptic that you want to be, and the XR, I think, really need to further sort of push themselves towards, which is effectively, an analogy could be the wartime situation. It's the sergeant in the trench with the troops. They're surrounded. They've got virtually no chance, but they go, well, either we sit here and we know we're going to die, or actually, let's do it. Come on, let's go. Let's take these people on. Let's confront this huge problem and try and fight our way through it. There might only be a couple of us that get through, but come on, let's do it. I think it's that mentality. It's realizing, accepting the problem is real, it's huge, it ain't going to go away, so therefore at least try. Which is why I think, in a business sense, innovation can really help us here, because we have to think innovatively and realistically to do things that can confront this problem.
So there's two things that are coming up for me at the moment. So one is connected to the kind of what do we trust? Where's the truth in this issue? Because in many ways, what's happening in Australia, at least my sense is that you've still got this kind of media story and this kind of government that are kind of refusing to tell the truth. But the reality on the ground for people is completely different. It's completely, they're in this thing, they're feeling it, they're embodying this kind of horrific shift that's going on, and yet you have a kind of the narrative in the cult or society still trying to ignore it. And I'm sort of curious about how this, as we sort of we've had these kind of bubbles and systems around us, kind of social media, and all the stuff that's shifted politics all over the place. Because the story, our perception of the world, or the story that we've believed, has been served up to us. But now that the reality is starting to sort of play out in people's lives, so I'm thinking about in the UK, what might happen this year? Will it, with Brexit, will it be actually because trade just falls off the cliff because we are actually, we're not going to be able to provide all these amazing jobs and growth, back to the growth mantra again, but. Will the realities start to unfold in people's lives that are going to, is that going to also help these kind of accelerations that are needed away from, again, this kind of promise of this sort of world, this continual kind of perception of growth and, materials and, we can just, we're all right because Australia's on the other side of the world. I mean, you have a lot of that, I feel, that's going on a bit. It's like, this sense still that people haven't quite figured out that everything's interconnected. Climate doesn't do walls. It's but sort of what's how that might.
I can say that's interesting because yesterday I was over at the RSA seeing the wonderful Lisa Nandy, who gets my vote. I always thought she's brilliant. I met her a few times at think tank things. A huge amount of respect for her. And also really like Jess Phillips. But anyway, so Lisa Nandy she's talking about this in part of a sort of platform for her leadership bid for Labour Party sort of leadership, and she was talking about a bit about internal politics, and as the red wall had been smashed obviously in the recent election, she's talking about building a red bridge to get over those areas, and then building a red bridge amongst global workers to go back to the basis of Labour as it was, and linking climate absolutely at the centre of this, on that exact basis of everything's interlinked, and Australia isn't just something you watch on TV and then switch over for X Factor and then quietly forget it, even though you may want to do that. Because, I know the analogy we saw again, New Year, people, for instance, a classic one is, we all read it, people in New Zealand going up to the mountains for, some beautiful whatever, skiing or something, whatever you do in New Zealand, never been there, and some fresh air, and you could smell Australia burning from a mountaintop in New Zealand. So, her point about, Lisa Nandy's point about everything is interlinked, this ain't going to go away, is if you see someone like that, who's going to have a hopefully ever bigger platform to talk about, then it is a wholly constructive thing, while other politicians obviously are effectively ignoring it or just giving it the most minimal sort of nod.
Yeah, and I guess I mean getting into this this new book, Influencers and Revolutionaries: How Innovative Trailblazers, Trends and Catalysts Transforming Business. Looking forward to reading this one.
Marvelous.
What thinking about this moment in time then, where we're in right now, and all this kind of unraveling that's going on. Give us a sense of what's come out of this book. Like what have you kind of discovered on this?
Well, what I found about it was that so I thought, again, I'm under no illusions. The world doesn't need another book on innovation because, quite frankly, going to any bookshop and you can bear it under the weight of them, and so I thought, what can one do differently? So I was just looking at I looked at every major sector. So whatever. Banking and sort of finance and insurance, fashion, retail, drinks, food, car industry, whatever, What I found really interesting, I was looking at cutting edge innovation in each one of them. So who are the bigger legacy players and who are the startups who are doing genuinely interesting things, okay? And what I found as I was researching it, and this one took about, again, just over a year to write, was that along with all the things that one would expect, because obviously anybody can just research innovation and can research who's doing interesting stuff if you've got the time, obviously anyone who can write can do it, But what was interesting to me, having done tons of innovation research over the years, when you knew all the things about IoT and AI and MR and all that sort of stuff, was this issue, again, of the climate crisis, linking into every single sector in a way that I think a lot of people, again, in terms of joining the dots, if someone, I think, was to have said a year ago, what connects, finance and fashion and car sector and the future of cities and the future of work and whatever, it'd been, I don't know. But this thing about the climate crisis and the emissions curve impacting every, as I'm saying, I think every innovative decision from now on will have to be taken on the basis of the first thing you consider is the impact of what you're doing on the emissions curve.
Yeah, that's the lens, right?
Which,
through everything.
Yeah, which like a year ago, 5 years ago, that would have been a ridiculous statement. It would have been, unfortunately, the correct statement, but in terms of its believability, its credibility, people are going, what are you talking about, you freak? Now,
I had that a lot.
Yes, exactly. Now I think it's becoming an ever more, unfortunately, bluntly obvious point that hopefully is going to be very soon. Tragically, it's so obvious that it's like, yeah, we know that. Good. What are you going to do about it? So talk about at the beginning of, I talk about a ton of this interesting other thinkers. Everyone go back to the whatever you say, the godfather of sort of skepticism, René Descartes, and his big thing about question everything if you want to confront the truth in this context in a business sector, as I don't know, Elon Musk did, saying do cars really have to be built this way, the way they've always been built? Why is that? Who said that? Is that the law? No. And so obviously Tesla and have all the rest of it. So that idea, first of all, of if you want to be truly innovative on either the most basic level, we are redoing some packaging or we are redesigning whatever it happens to be on a product or service level, then basically question all the sacred cows that go with that sector, and then crucially have absolutely, if you want to put it in the XR terms, that at the forefront of your thinking, because that is where it is going. Well, that's where it is now, should we say.
Did you and have you? So one of the things that I'm always really curious about with all of this stuff is this. I always get a sense there's some there's a belief out there that we can just evolve our economy to like a green economy. Do you know what I mean? So it's kind of same kind of thing, but everything's kind of low impact, circular. Emissions potentially being drawn down. All these great things. But actually behaviours still remain, so we'll still be like travelling to work every day in our electric cars or whatever. But actually, when you look at things like, what's the biggest pollutant in the ocean? It's actually plastic particles off car tyres, for example. Or, why are cities becoming difficult places to live? Because we can't move in them, because of transportation. So like there's some things that feel like it's not as straightforward as and also then, extraction of materials and different materials we're going to need kind of for the components, and it's still a very kind of materials based. There's still a lot of energy, although the demand for energy still is. We live in a very high energy culture, right? So this idea that we can just shift to a kind of green energy, high energy culture feels to me a bit deluded, and sort of it feels like there are some things that have to change, like this, and I'm kind of interested in. And again, it's something like the Flybe thing yesterday, whatever it was,
Yeah.
So it's like, no, we'll subsidise low airfare. At the same time, train travel is getting more and more expensive. Whereas actually maybe a more sensible thing would be to sort of hospice that sector out, support it over a journey of putting it down and moving it into something else, right? Which is, so I'm kind of curious again, is that stuff, are you sensing that there are businesses that are opening up to this kind of reality, or is there still very much a sense of, it's business as usual, but we'll just green it all?
I think it is to me more of the latter, because I think the argument of the absolutist argument, which one could say on paper is naturally the correct one, in terms of widespread systematic change needs to happen right now. I think the Gail Bradbrook, Roger Hallam argument, the Greta Thunberg argument, which is this is so spectacularly serious. And Greta Thunberg saying next week at Davos she'll be giving a speech that was put out a day or so yesterday to the media. We've got to basically stop using fossil fuels now. Now, on paper, that is obviously correct, as we are here now in a city that is a ludicrous suggestion, as in that is not going to happen. There are things that should happen, and that would be the right thing to do in terms of our collective futures and the future of the planet, as we all know. But in terms of would any leading politician and any governmental organisation tomorrow morning do precisely that, I think there is zero chance of it. So in terms of, the one argument to that, I think the Greta Thunberg argument from mid last year was, well, if we're not going to make instant systematic change, then it's over. At which point, I think then you have a real problem in your hands, because then people go, well, if we can't make that astonishing level of, banning cars now as we speak, banning all air travel now as we speak, shutting down all, then we might as well just do nothing and give up or whatever. And we mustn't do that, obviously. So I think there is clearly a pragmatic element to this, which is, yes, we have to, as consumers, actively, obviously, consume less, consume better, consume from better, good companies that have green issues at the heart of what they're about. And that is, I think, naturally the way it is going to go. And yes, if they're going to be, 20 years ago, no one ever heard of Tesla, etc. So that sort of giant thinking is going to have to come in on an innovative basis to radically alter how we do and what we do it and all the rest of it. And as part of all that, there also is a huge role for the billion-dollar persuasion machine, the ad industry, who, remember them, who may have been, while they sort of sob into their, as I put in the book, while they sob while they're reading, horrendous Simon Sinek, Start With Why, the world's most annoying book. Meanwhile, because they're great at enabling behavioural change and sort of changing attitudes, they've got a massive job to do. Their time has come to rise to the challenge and actually get this point across in a way that you give it to people. Sorry, to finish off, like Morris Sarchi, brutal simplicity of thought. When he would talk about, where he's absolutely correct as a great manipulator of opinion. If you say, you need to bring people with you. There is a reason why things like liberty, eternity, equality, or fraternity was such a rallying cry of the French Revolution, because everyone understood it and everyone could translate it and talk about it. There's a reason why things like the Sermon on the Mount, the Declaration of Independence, and the launch of the Communist Manifesto were such enormously powerful documents, because they were incredibly clear, they resonated, they say they were understandable. It's again coming back to people like Extinction Rebellion, who at the moment, long may they continue, I think they're fantastic, are quite frankly the ones who are leading the way here. They need to have really, they need to have clarity, consistency, and leadership, to use the old Adlan term, to get across a message that everyone really, really gets and can then repeat to their friends and can get behind in terms of a sort of motivational rallying cry.
It doesn't help, does it, when you've got people even like The Guardian putting them on headlines as an extremist organisation, but the Met Police classifying them. But
I was at the New Office a couple of days ago over in London Fields, and it's hilarious. They exactly sort of the sort of MI5 sort of target, and they're a bunch of, obviously, as they are, great bunch of sort of well-meaning activists, eating vegan food and thinking good thoughts and doing good actionable things to benefit everyone. And I know it's spectacular how frightened of them that the powers that be are, the Priti Patels of the world. I was in the meeting at the around the corner from the Commons about 6 months ago. I'm get a policy exchange, or I get a political think tanks all the time. I was at the policy exchange meeting when they were launching their undermining document of XR, basically. When is the head of on the panel is David Blunkett, oddly enough, head of the counter-terrorism unit, a liberal sort of a lord, and then some people from the think tank, and also the great XR lawyer from Bindmans who worked with Chris Wiley and all the rest of it. And they were just talking about the future of the city in general, in terms of one thing that all city mayors and governments are having to deal with is this idea of permanent protest. So a bit like going back to sort of Roman times. So the idea of protest being something that is just a non-stop thing now in the modern and ongoing city, is something that governments have to deal with and understand and allow if they are in a liberal democracy, because we're allowed to sort of the right of assembly. But then they were saying what they found really unusual at that point, looking at how they policed the April 2019 protests, was the police had never really confronted or been confronted with mass activation on the basis of very well-meaning, non-violent people that were doing things for the public good and were cooperating totally with the police, telling them where they were going to be and what they were going to do. And when the police have basically, when they judge how they're going to police any crowd, be it at a concert or a football match or whatever, or protest, they always do it on the basis of, is there danger to life or property and all the rest of it, and are these people telling us what they're doing? And obviously XR, because obviously it's so well thought through, saying, please come and join in our planning meetings. Here are our email addresses. You're more than welcome to join us. And as they always do, totally welcome into the police, saying, you've got kids probably, you must be really worried about them. Please come and join our protest. So it's very interesting how that April protest, the goodwill was absolutely there. Very different mood in October. Obviously had the hideous annoyance of the two imbeciles, whatever, on the tube roof in East End, which oddly enough I think actually worked in some way, because they got everyone talking about the fact that this wasn't in any way anything that XR had agreed with, so I thought it fascinating how that whole thing is being organised and run, and where it's coming from, and how important they are.
We live on a life-giving rock called Earth, hurtling through space. How bonkers is that? If you like what you're hearing, please do give us a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps others find the show.
I guess this other thing I'm curious of is that, so you talk about permanent protest as an idea, and I guess I'm often exploring sort of what I'd call radical collaborations, unusual suspects kind of coming together to kind of figure things out. And when I look at the science, and when I look at climate, ecology, extraction of resource, all this stuff, and it's terrifying the rate this is happening. And then you look at kind of, our sort of business as usual, not just at a business level, but our lifestyles and our institutionalized lives in this kind of world we're in. And you can't see, it's still very hard to see where this opening up is going to happen. I mean, look at education, for example. I think there's a really strong argument for, and I know the youth strikers are pushing for this, but a complete overhaul of the curriculum, right? If our children are going to have to witness this falling apart going on, at least give them the option to learn their way into it, right? So that they're feeling like they can adapt, or they're not, because at the moment it feels like for many kids they're sort of they're seeing this future unfolding, and yet they're still being pushed through a kind of a trajectory to this sort of high carbon type economy, and a sense of kind of a process, a journey that they need to go through, and gates they have to go over. That's one thing. And again, even in business, the model is so entrenched, the consumption model, the production model, the business planning timelines, the systems, politics, right? Everything still looks so fixed, and still so separate as well. And I know there's obviously collaborations going on all over the place. A lot of it is still under the radar. But do you get a sense? Because my sense, let's go to politics, after that election. And, I'm a progressive. I have no real entity. I've been a Green Party member for years, but I voted tactically in the thing. What I wanted to see, was an alliance of progressive parties that frankly said, we accept this thing that's unfolding, and we put climate crisis at the front and center of of this revolution we need at every level. That's what I think, and I think there's a lot of people that wanted to see that. But yet now we go into this new government, and I see the Labour, the leadership thing, and I'm not embedded in it, so I don't know. But my sense is, again, it's still quite tribal. It's still like what's going to sort Labour out and get Labour going again. I saw a bit of Clive Lewis talking about opening it up, and he's obviously out now. And what's worrying me again is that we don't seem to be accepting that the complexity of this world demands radical collaboration, right? We need different perspectives. We need different ideas. We need to sit with opposing views and thoughts and find new ideas together, right? And I think that feels, we're seeing the Citizens Assembly thing starting to, to travel out, and that's a positive thing. But I'm worried that, I don't know, I guess, like, are you seeing signals of this kind of sense of we are, as businesses, as institutions, are going to need to kind of step into more of these kind of, so like, exactly like with the XR thing, for example, for me, like, why wouldn't you want, good, solid, non-violent groups in the mix who are thinking of the future of our citizens in a beautiful way, right? Mm-hmm. Why wouldn't you want that voice represented, at these different levels? And again, maybe that's my utopic naivety, whatever. But I'm sort of, that's what I'm really trying to find signals are. Have we learned? Are we really, really accepting the science and what's going on, or is there still this kind of hubris, this kind of power of we're in control, pulling levers, And what's your sense through the book? Are you getting a sense that there is going to be more of this way of being coming through?
Well, in terms of a changed way of being and cooperation. So I think cooperation is clearly a thing that's resonating across society, across cultures and all the rest of it. So there's far more cooperation, and also on a business level, than there has been before. And on a sort of level of radical cooperation, the more that we say, the smarter, sharper thinkers are realizing that this is actually a way, again, to punch through. On a business sense, it's a way to punch through because, again, there's so little differentiation, as I mentioned earlier on, blah, 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 between brands, that in order to really do something fascinating, compelling and different, you need to be bringing people in, which is why things like in the future of work, one of the key things there is, are putting together teams whereby you have, where you deliberately putting together teams full of people who think differently. And you do that, people talk about, diversity, and diversity 10 years ago effectively meant something like the UN, or what looked like the UN in a room, of like to people with different backgrounds, different colours, different sort of creeds, etc. Okay, to put it just really bluntly. Now, I think there's a lot of thinking about actually it's not so much that anymore, although that's obviously to be very much sort of promoted, again, particularly in ad land, which is almost looks like, so you go into an ad agency, it looks like the Ku Klux Klan. It's still just ridiculously out of date. But you need to have groups of different thinkers put together. In terms of the Citizens Assembly piece and in terms of the political piece, it's still, as we all know, completely the case. You talk to anyone normal, inverted commas, and they'll tend to say the same thing every time, no matter where you ask someone, wherever you're traveling or wherever it is. And you say, what's it like living here? What's the sort of a government like? What sort of political parties do people really want? And everyone always says the same thing, which is, what I'd really like is for the best people from each party to get together and to run the country. And it doesn't matter if that's someone talking to you in Dallas or in wherever, or it's like Doncaster, or whatever. People say exactly the same thing, and obviously they never get it. It's really odd how in every other walk of life, whatever people want as consumers, quite frankly, they can get, because if the market's there, the genius of capitalism, one could say on that level, it offers up an answer to it. You don't get it politically because of the powers that be. So while the whole Citizens Assembly piece, which again on an XR level, and my mind's gone blank for a second, but it's the person I thought was really compelling here. She lives down somewhere in the West Country, because I met her at the latest Byline Festival. Really, really dynamic individual. And so there's a thing there of Citizen Assemblies obviously are a fantastic idea in a Boris Johnson world with the sort of with the majority he has. Is he likely to listen? I think the chances of that are 0.0 something. Quite frankly, is it the right thing to do? Obviously, yes. At the moment with him there, I say, is there a chance of it really happening in a way that is actually meaningful? Unfortunately, I think it ain't going to happen. Certainly during this, the next few years, we'll see what happens when the next election comes up, and one has to desperately hope you've got an effective opposition, and that, again, you look at people, you mentioned the Green Party, obviously living in Brighton, I voted Green for years, the wonderful Caroline Lucas, but I'm under no illusions. Brighton is a complete bubble. It doesn't reflect anywhere else in the country at all. You live in the West Country, I go down to see my dear old mum down in Taunton a lot, down there, I was talking about XR there recently in the art centre, and people go, you know what, a lot of the XR activity is people just blocking the doors in the local shop, saying, shopping is bad. People going, I'm here to buy some food for my granny. Can you get out of the way, please? XR cannot become an irritant in that sort of way. That whole thing about keeping everyone on side is so obviously vital, and it's a thin line to tread.
Do you been doing a bit of work last year with Patagonia, which has been amazing, but obviously they are the company that always stands out. But thinking now, again, are you sensing more progressive thinking businesses are going to start looking at, you talk about in the post business, about brand activism but are you sensing we're going to see more kind of almost collaborations going on between kind of grassroots activism and brands, as we know, and they've got enormous reach, some of them huge influence. If they're, do we see more of this? Because I guess if politics and the political system is not going to move at the speed we demand, we're going to need to see these other actors getting involved, right?
Oh, completely. So in there, I put a manifesto, as I put into both books, because it's an easy thing to then to remember, and also for journalists to write about. So in there, I put in there in the piece about authenticity that everyone again has been banging on about authenticity for years without actually reminding themselves what it actually means, and so we can talk about that in a minute in terms of what this really goes back to. But there it talks about brands have to become ever more apolitical and get behind apolitical issues. And again, an obvious example is a brand that I can't stand, but has done incredibly well, because I wrote about them years ago. And when I remember meeting Naomi Klein back in the 90s, before she wrote No Logo, and she was very kind to give me quotes for a piece I was writing at that point for the Face magazine about advertising. And obviously No Logo became this powerhouse of a book. It still totally stacks up. I really admire her thinking. She's an amazing woman, amazing person. And so, one of the brands she took on there in terms of their bullying behaviour, in terms of their dubious production behaviour, obviously were Nike, in terms of third world factories and child workers. Nike have sorted their act out big time. I still have nothing for them and never would, but that's a completely subjective view. But in terms of obviously their work 18 months ago and last year with Colin Kaepernick, standing up to be counted, getting behind an apolitical issue so that isn't party political based, but that is just socially important, and talking about him obviously with his admirable actions around sort of reason to take the knee around the sort of the Black Lives Matter protests or sort of activism, was then propelled even further by Nike getting behind it. What's vital there, obviously, are things like relevance. It would have been ridiculous for that campaign to have been done by a dairy brand. If it was done by sort of a cheese brand, it has been insane. They should be doing something about obviously animal welfare, whatever. But for a brand that has a huge amount of African Americans, apart from anything else, as part of their consumer base, it makes absolute sense for them to be saying, both on a moral level and on a business level, for them to be saying, this is something that's impacting these people, our consumers, and we should be doing something about it. And if the American version of the Daily Mails of the world goes berserk, and if you get a few angry letters from a few angry white people, fair enough, we'll take that one on board and then just push on. The key thing for Nike, obviously, here is that, as they've done, it couldn't just be an advert, inverted commas. It has to be now where they are. In 5 years' time, we have to be sitting here and Nike doing the same thing, standing up to be counted. So I think this issue about standing up to be counted is hugely important, as political parties in many cases back away from these key issues. There's a space there, and brands doing the right things have to jump into that space to enable positive change.
And I guess with the other tension with the climate crisis is the sort of the white elephant of consumption, in terms of in the fact that we're knowing more and more this is an ecological crisis, mainly being driven by extraction and destruction of ecosystems and for resources that we're turning into all these lovely things and food and God knows what else it is that we're consuming. And I guess this is again this other thing, like the tension, not only to stand up and be authentic in light of what is happening, but what does that look like authentically from kind of business decisions and because I guess that's it. It's interesting with the the single-use plastic crisis, for example. We still have whatever companies are trying to do with moving to recycled plastics or trying to look gradually at different types of serving units, but ultimately still, you could argue that many of these companies, they basically, they are sellers of single-use plastic with stuff in it. I mean, it's kind of, I don't want to just filter out, but again, it's like there are these categories, if you like, that are just, again, in a sense, like, has their time come? You know what I mean? Have they had their ilk?
Sure. So on one side, it's just consumption itself. So consumption continuing, but the type of consumption changing.
Right.
So as we saw 2 years ago, veganism became the fastest growing trend in the UK, and a lot of that has been down to a very much a sort of a politicized decision of I've realized what is going on, and something that I can do as an individual to actually to do my bit in a wartime spirit is to actually change what I consume. And it may well be that I just still I'm a flexitarian, whatever, so I may still have my juicy steak once every month, but that's it. The rest of the time I'll eat it in a different way, and so that is a positive act. And again, that goes back to this issue when we talk about authenticity and morality on a brand level, although obviously a lot of people will just choke as they sort of hear me say those words. There's an issue of, people talk about, so it goes back to Aristotle talking about, the virtuous person does a virtuous thing for virtuous reasons. So, do you act in isolation? Do you do the right thing when no one's looking? Or do you do the right thing because you're scared of being caught out? Now, quite frankly, if the impact of that act is the same, then quite frankly, if in the Nike sense, if they're doing good things just because they want to appear to be a nice company, so what? Couldn't care less. If they're doing the right thing, good. And it just as, so if Shell turn around tomorrow and actually did do something genuinely meaningful and different, good. I would support that. Doesn't matter if I like the people who work there, if I like what they're about. But we have to also, they think about demonizing bad businesses or bad brands. We've got to be very careful about that one of demonizing the act and not the person, and demonizing not saying that everyone that works for Shell is evil. Evidently not. And yet there's you've got to be very careful again in activism about just calling out, say, acts rather than individuals, I think. Yeah,
and I guess this is the sort of mad complexity of this situation that none of us have been in before, right? Because we're sort of calling for the downfall of fossil fuels, but at the same time, you can't function in this world right now. You step out your door and you're emitting something, whether it's and so unpicking this mess, I guess this is the thing, isn't it? It's like there's this kind of ticking clock, and then there's this kind of how entrenched everything is in our lives, and it's the pace that we can either reinvent everything. Yeah. What are we prepared to let go of? What do we feel we can adapt and evolve to? Yeah, and what do we accept is coming, and we need to bring that kind of we need to start. I saw this thing on Twitter, going back to Twitter again yesterday. Someone had tweeted something about, it was in Australia again, but it was someone saying we've all the government's always said mitigation, adaptation is way too it's way too costly to do at the time. And it was as though they were airdropping tons of carrots to feed wallabies who had no food. And I'd love to see what the cost of feeding airdropping carrots to wallabies is going to come in. And, you sort of mean there's these, it's such fragile times, isn't it? And that's the
incredibly fragile times. But again, it's like something that I noted as I wrote the new book was that, I mean, it might be obvious to everyone, but certainly from an external point of view, let's say 18 months ago or a year or so ago when I started writing this one, when one said, okay, right, so in terms of the environment, in terms of the crisis, climate crisis, which industries or sectors are actually doing something about this, that are really taking it on? And, one might think, veganism. Anything else? Can't think of something. Once you then start researching it, the positive news I found was that in every sector I looked at, as I say, I looked at every major sector there is, and most of the major subsectors within them. So if I looked at travel, I'd look at, in a broader sense from either, cruise liners going to the Arctic so you can, photograph these starving polar bears from the luxury of your, whatever, while you're handed a chilled Chablis, something, just these appalling, I know.
Extreme civilization.
Yeah, exactly. That sort of J.G. Ballard thing. And also like the future of cars and all the rest of it. But the key thing was that the encouraging news was that in every single sector, there are tons of people working flat out on this problem. As in, it's not a, it's they're finally woken up to it, and so and you go to any interesting conference or tech event or whatever it is, all the startups are just flat out on this one. So I think the issue of, have people got it? Yes, they have. Is it done on a multi-sector international basis? Yes, the news is out there. Again, unfortunately, if you like inverted commas, but fortunately, stuff is happening. People are doing things. It's not as though. So again, coming back to, I know we keep going about Extinction Rebellion for all the right reasons, but that thing about the awareness bit, when they exploded onto the public scene from where we are now in London, a year or so ago, out of frankly nowhere, from most people's point of view, they have done society, the world, an incredible service, because they have just hammered those points into the public consciousness. If they all disappeared tomorrow, then their job, when we write it in history, it would have been a great moment. I think, Gail Bradbrook should be, whatever, make her the queen, whatever, but one of those. It's so the consciousness bit has been done. Now it's the next stage is keeping the foot flat on the, should we say, the green accelerator to keep people doing stuff and making sure that everyone realizes on an individual basis you can do something. It's not just a case of waiting, right? So I sit here and wait for Shell to just stop doing bad stuff, or actually what can I do myself in my home, wherever I live, that's actually a positive act that has meaning. That has to be really pushed through, because that, again, gives people realistic hope.
I'm thinking about the new book. What was there anything in particular that really kind of excited you, through the process? Any specifics that you could mention that were sort of surprising to you? And
surprising. Well, in terms of the chapters, so one of the chapters I say was on finance and insurance. And quite frankly, a year or so ago, you said that words to me, I would have been asleep by the time you finished the second word. It's but it's remarkable. The world's least interesting sector. It was actually tons going on there. So again, in terms of what's going on there, both internally and externally. So yet again mentioning Extinction Rebellion. We saw, I think, actually today and also yesterday, they've been outside banks and insurers having a go at them, calling out them for investing pension fund money in fossil fuel companies. And so it's all those things of both them being pressurized from the outside to do better, to just shift around what it is that they're doing, which button they're pressing when they're choosing which company or sector to invest all this money in. That has spectacular impacts, alongside those businesses themselves saying, right, where should we be going next? What should we be investing in? If you're in the innovation department at Shell, which we imagine is something like called Dr. Evil, with their sort of grey uniforms and their bald heads,
burn.
Exactly. I'd imagine that scene, but one has to hope, and I do believe that they are going. We do know.
I got trolled by someone from Shell on LinkedIn during the last rebellion. Yeah,
fantastic.
I was
that's quite an honour.
I know, it was really weird. It was it was the start of the October Rebellion. There was the mainstream media again was sort of projecting this kind of really evil kind of nasty vibes out in London being called to a standstill, and obviously being out on the streets is a completely different picture. I was hanging out with all these wonderful old women and teenagers and all sorts from all things, and I just posted a comment to someone's thing about saying, look, go out and feel what's going on. Don't just take what the mainstream media is telling you is happening. Go out and feel it for yourself, and then make up your mind. So I had some sort of innovation dude from Shell going to me, What are you saying here? Look, we shouldn't trust. We shouldn't trust the narratives of the media. Where are we supposed to get our information from? And all this kind of stuff. Yeah, I know, it's absolutely bonkers.
Brilliant. As he sort of pulls a lever and you're sort of going to the burning thing. Amazing.
I was trying to sort of explain this idea of experiential knowledge, and it just seemed to it didn't seem to cut through.
But again, that in terms of that goes back to sort of John Locke, and he often spoke about sort of all knowledge is experiential. So along with these Descartesian thing of question everything, no sacred cows. The John Locke thing obviously was all about what have you personally seen and heard yourself? And when you're, again, it comes back to the exchange of information. Word of mouth has all throughout history been the most powerful form of communication. We believe each other as opposed to what we're told, hopefully through Adland. And that's all about, I saw this myself, I read that's crap because actually I was there and this is what it was like. And so the idea of word of mouth, that ain't going to go away. And as we said, the benefits of things like XR is because everyone's invited. It's such a mass movement, which it had to be when Roger Hallam did his research. That whole thing about you've got to go mass very, very quickly and you've got to be disruptive, blah, 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 in order to force governments to notice and do something. Because it's mass, people do meet each other. People then go home and they talk about what they saw and the word gets out, which is, again, why they've been so effective. Because you go anywhere now and it isn't just a bunch of, as the Daily Mail may have put it, a bunch of annoying people from Shoreditch talking about it, or kids from St Martin's or whatever. When we go back to the West Country, or when go back to whatever, my wife's parents up in sort of Tynemouth, everyone's talking about it everywhere, which is great.
What's your hunch with switching to back to politics again? What's your hunch with this? With this new government and that relationship with, like, Extinction Rebellion, school strikes, for example, because I got a real sense last year that these things obviously were really bubbling up, but the governments were focused on other things. It's sort of almost allowing this stuff to happen, but now they've got a clear run and this majority. Do you get a sense they're going to come down harder on this stuff, or do you?
I think they will. Yeah, I think very much so, because you clearly got obviously you got the right wing in charge, and again, having said that, again, it's on a political science level. Most people in the UK broadly straddle the centre ground, and clearly over the last few years most people have been broadly just to the right of the centre ground, which again is often thought as being the natural default position for the UK electorate. We had a blip during the Blair years, and people much maligned Blair. People forget the first few years of Blair were fantastic. I mean, it really was a breath of fresh air, as they say, after the years with John Major. So early Blair was absolutely positive and progressive, and it was a great time to be around. What you've now got under people like Priti Patel, who is, I think, a really unpleasant figure, a deeply of the bad version of the right figure. I've got nothing personally sort of hugely against most conservative thinkers or most sort of mainstream Labour thinkers. It's that, to me, what worries me is are the far right and the far left. I think that unfortunately, I think Corbyn was the greatest champion the Tories ever had, because they just saw him lead Labour into oblivion. If the whole point of being politics is to be in power, to state the most obvious thing of all time. If Labour want to be in power, they've got to get someone in who is more palatable for a mainstream audience. Someone like, I personally really like Lisa Nandy. I think she's great because she is super sharp, really gets it, knows her stuff, and has mass appeal, and could take them to somewhere where hopefully they could be back in power. But coming back to the whole protest thing, I think Priti Patel will clearly want the police to come down harder next time. All the thing about, the police dancing with protesters in the way they used to, let's say, in the old Notting Hill Carnival classic photograph, I think that's really, unfortunately, in many ways gone. At the same time, there's a lot of, perceived pushback against that from the police themselves, because obviously they get it, and they're saying, I mean, when I was at the policy exchange thing, the police who are there going, if you're going to police a crowd, you'd far rather police a XR crowd than a sort of like Millwall Cardiff match, one of those, they're your ideal lot. Yeah. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this one plays out. But
and it's a big year, right, with the with the good cop, bad cop at the end of the year. It's like, that building up to that, what's going to happen? How's that going to be perceived? How will this government want that? What's their kind of going to be their intentions for the end of year? How
sure.
They want to be perceived in the world.
Well, I mean, a lot of people have said, so one of the benefits to the moderates on the right at the moment is thought to be that, as we all know, because it has such a big majority, it means that Johnson isn't sort of trapped by the far right. So he's got more leverage, basically, to do what he likes. Again, you look at him, is he an evil person? No, I don't think he is. Is he an opportunist? Absolutely. Did he sort of go whichever way he thought he needed to go to be in power? Yes, he did. A lesson for Labour there. But he did it sort of, if you say, fairly realistically. I think he was less far right than Corbyn was far left. And to take him on, you've got to have someone that I think Emily Thornberry, I can't stand her personally, but I think she could nail him at the dispatch box. Just obviously barrister, super bright. She's great. You've got to have someone that can take him on, and you can't do it from an extremist point of view because you can't take the mass with you. Therefore, you won't get the votes. Therefore, you won't get in power. What Johnson would love to have an extremist, someone from the extreme left to be a Labour leader because it would just enable him to do whatever he wants to do. His biggest fear is someone who is sensible and realistic and gets it and doesn't fall for his bluster and his bluff and his enraging way of talking, his refusal to keep to the point and all those things. You need someone, again, like in that instance, Emily Thornberry, being a barrister, she just sees through all that. She goes, no, answer the question. Don't talk me, answer the question, and she won't let him go. So I think she would do, on that instance, a very good job.
It's going to be an interesting year.
It's going to be a fascinating year, to put it mildly.
Yeah. When's the book out? When's the new one out?
A couple of weeks, actually. So here we are in, mid-January. So out UK, February the 3rd, America, February the 25th, I believe.
Right.
So there we go. We'll see.
Yeah, no, well, look, I mean, it's been great to chat. Thanks for there's a lot in there. I mean, as I say, I'm looking forward to getting stuck into this. There was other stuff I was, surveillance capitalism. We didn't tap into that. That's one thing I was because it's just like, that's a thing that I think that...
Do it quickly if you like.
Yeah, just because what I'd love you to, just again, because I know like there'll be a lot of people that won't really understand what this stands for, what this is about.
Okay, so the whole thing about... So again, this comes back to my point about privacy. So I wrote about privacy back in 2017 when, quite frankly, people were, again, it sounds arrogant, but I wrote about it because I could see what was coming down, because I had time to research it, okay, which most people don't, obviously. And I could see that this whole thing about privacy was going to become a bigger and bigger issue. The idea at that point about surveillance technology being invited into our homes. So at that point, it was the birth of things like Alexa, and then there's talks of, so when Alexa can talk to Cortana behind your back, and they can. And we talked about fridges ordering stuff for you. It's like, yeah, whatever, man.
Siri talking behind your back.
Yeah, exactly. So there's all that almost like half joking talk about it. Then we began to see the issue of on that Orwellian level, that idea of when people would say, my God, there's poor people in North Korea who are basically looked at the entire time and they're under surveillance all the time. Isn't that dreadful? And then the point being made quite quickly, there were more surveillance cameras in London than the whole of North Korea, and that sounded a bit odd. Then when you had things like just the early stages of a word beginning to come out of what was happening in Western China, with the Chinese government obviously persecuting the Uyghurs, the Muslim a Chinese minority. And so I wrote about surveillance capitalism. I have to say, a year before the famous book of the same name came out, one of those. So I wrote about that and saying, look, this is really, really huge. So on one level, you had privacy being looked at from the point of view of everyone going, well, I know that Facebook are grabbing all my data and it's being used by advertisers, but, if you try and explain why it's so technical and so boring, can you just shut up? Then when you were saying to people on a different side, well, actually, the next big thing there is going to be, as I alluded to earlier on, brands going, or new brands saying, right, if we can take your data from you, we'll hire it from you, then we'll hire it out to advertisers at a profit, and we can explain to you in detail how that works. But if we just say that your data is worth, let's say, 300 to 500 quid a year for you personally, people go, you know what, you got me when you start mentioning cash. So yes, I'll take that. The rest of it, just go and do whatever you want with it. So it's an active decision to allow your data to be used by someone else for hyper-targeting. So when it comes to the surveillance capitalism piece, when you begin to get the idea that when people are now realizing, as they evidently are, that you are being tracked online all the time, nothing is actually ever lost, and certainly from the point of view of all these things joining together. So just as we join together issues around climate and the impact on society and the world and culture, if we can link together the fact that we're being tracked all the time, that our data is being used in many cases in ways that obviously we don't have the slightest idea, if it's being, and then also if data at the same time is being manipulated and mucked about with by bad actors, and that links into alternative facts and fake news, and then we got things like obviously deep fake technology, which I wrote about then, which has now become obviously the real concern of the 2020 presidential election, when you have politicians appearing to make speeches they never made because it's been made up. And at the same time, it allows people like Trump to then deny he actually made a speech, because he'll just say, oh, it was a deep fake video, despite it being a real video, because they both look exactly the same. Then again, this comes back to the idea I made right at the beginning of this, which is it all goes to a very destabilizing space whereby no one believes anything. No one trusts anything. Everyone's suspicious of everything. And it's a horrible thing. And again, just like the climate crisis, we haven't been here before. We've never been in a situation whereby, just as Orwell discussed, what would you do when if we were to say, if all of us here now were saying, so, we're carrying around these things that track us the entire time, and we have things in our homes that listen into us and video us, it'd be going, are you mad? What have you done? And at the same level, you talk to psychologists, they'll say, bluntly speaking, there's a Western need for privacy. We don't like the idea of someone looking over our shoulder or listening in the entire time. There's a very different, bluntly put, Eastern/Asian point of view, which is, if you don't like that, then what have you got to hide? Are you a criminal? So the argument you'll have, or the discussion you'll have about privacy in Seoul or in London, let's say, or in Berlin, are very different conversations. We have to have, there is a basic intrinsic psychological need for privacy here, and there just isn't there. And again, that goes back to the issues of communism. It goes to issues about trust in society. Communist states, the whole thing about informing on your neighbors. It's why, very briefly, there's a total lack of trust let's say in China, to put a blunt statement, which goes right back to the deliberate sense of mistrust and suspicion put on a local level by the communist authorities and authoritarian state. It's why, the polarity of that statement is why things like Alibaba were so successful so quickly, when, as Jack Ma said, once you have trust, everything else is easy. And so what he did was basically digitize trust. And the classic example of digitized trust, as everyone uses, is Airbnb. The idea that when you and I were teenagers, if we'd said, oh, we're going to go off to wherever, some other foreign country, and I think I'm going to go and sleep in some stranger's house, or if your sister said it or whatever, your parents would have gone mental. It's like, what are you talking about? They might murder you in your sleep. But the idea being, obviously, at the most basic level, if I know that the person whose home I'm going to sleep in, if they know that I know who they are and that they can be found out, if they murder me, they'll be caught. And so therefore, digitization gave us digitized trust, which people like Rachel Botsman talks about in her book a lot. It's why we can call an Uber when we're completely drunk, happy to allow ourselves or our friends or whatever to get into a stranger's car at 3 a.m. Digitized trust. So again, all these things. So surveillance capitalism basically sort of linked across all those areas, because I think everything is so interlinked. You can't talk about one without the others, hence the book, and hence the problem writing it. I thought I was going mad having to hold all these things in my head the entire time, so I didn't double up, so saying, well, privacy links into fake news, and privacy links into disinformation, and disinformation links into misinformation, and misinformation links into sort of something else, and it's all, so you had to try and separate them to make them coherent and understandable and evidence what you're saying, so you're not just making it up, but do it in a way that is palatable.
It's mad. I mean, just sort of my sort of final thought on all this is like, I can't remember the author's name, it's gone, but I read a book, you probably know, but I read a book about 10 years ago called Empathic Civilization.
Sounds very good. And
it gave me a lot of hope, because it was talking about like this idea that humanity might evolve through this interconnectivity to effectively to a point where we do have this global empathy, because we understand through this ability to share all this knowledge and information that we understand, therefore we're able to kind of empathize interspecies level, at a cross-cultural level, whatever, and eventually we'll move to this moment in time. And this was way before the social internet kicked off, and it was kicking off, but it had, we hadn't got this kind of this post-truth world that we're in now. And I guess this is the thing, right? We've talked about this a lot, but we're in this climate and ecological crisis, and then we're in this kind of post-truth world, where actually it feels like intuitively, if we're gonna like sort this thing out, like we need to have trust. We need a kind of a world that has this, where trust comes back into our lives, where we're able to kind of step into this place of kind of empathy and respect and openness and courage collectively to move. And I guess this is the big question, right? Will we get there, or have we just, is there just too much now holding this kind of?
Oh no, I think we will get there, very much so. I think there's just such a thirst for honesty and truth and reliability because the world is so out of control. I think there's an absolute desperation for solid ground when everything seems so fluid and movable. When people always bang on about the fact that things are moving so quickly. Well, actually, they aren't moving that quickly. They moved a lot quicker about 10 years ago when things like Silicon Valley was really exploding. I mean, really, there's no real innovation that's come out of Silicon Valley in the last 5 years. That bit really happened very quickly earlier on. Not to say that something else won't happen that's very innovative, but certainly the recent past has been quite slow.
It's funny because as you're saying, it's making me think of... I forget his name, but he talks about as a futurist. He talks about which has always touched me. This idea that the kind of the breakthroughs we really need now, the most innovative breakthroughs are going to be like about what it is to be human, not.
Oh yes, that gets into things like spiral dynamics and all of that, and so that idea of just how we shift through different stages of consciousness, and it's why we admire. It's why we admire things, again, coming back to Patagonia. Yeah. It's not just because they're a nice company that make good outdoor clothing and have a few farmers markets and all the rest of it. There's a demonstration of how to act, how to be, a level of, I talk about humane capitalism a lot in that book, a demonstration that there's a different way of doing these things. You can still make a healthy profit, and that's to be encouraged. You can still have a perfectly nice lifestyle, whatever that may be, by doing things in a decent way, and it's not in what would have been dismissed, again, a decade ago in Daily Mail speak as being a pathetic liberal with a small L or just grow up point of view. There's a reason why we respect people who act in that decent way, who have a sense of genuine authenticity. There's a reason why people are so enamoured in a very niche level by things like, interesting talks, TED Talks, the Do Lectures. I know you're very involved. It's things like that. There's a reason why small festivals are so attractive. It's a reason why, despite the fact that we're told religion is collapsing, actually in many ways, it's coming right back, I think, in terms of religions of search of meaning and doing things for the social good. Yeah. I mean, there's, my wife goes to this church in Brighton called St. Peter's that just... no one else is looking after the homeless community. You don't look to Priti Patel to look after you if you're homeless. You look to your local church to welcome you in and to give you somewhere safe to be, and to feed you and to comfort you. And that's what we need. It's that sort of activity. So I think there's a ton of that out there. And again, unfortunately, the way the media is set up, as we know, they always say bad things happen quickly. Good things happen slowly, and the media loves quick things. So the media do not go, over the last, sort of few months, X many homeless people have been kindly looked after and have been given us a safe place to stay in the evening and a welcoming smile and a hot meal, because that ain't news. What is news is one homeless man stabbed someone in Sunderland. Yeah. Oh my God. And so that's the problem.
Keep the fear up.
keep the fear up, despite the fact that if you look at magazines like Positive News, huge amount of positivity out there, but again, I think it's being communicated just like the XR message increasingly on a word of mouth basis. Yeah. So it's why people are going to, I really want to watch News at 10. No, I don't want to have like the latest list of murders and rapes and things on fire. I want to basically sort of I want to be aware of it, but in terms of what I'm going to genuinely believe, it's the word of mouth thing from people who I respect, who I trust.
Amazing. We could go on, but we've had quite a good go here.
We started it was light, and it's now dark.
I know exactly. Sean, thank you for sharing your time. And the thing I just want to sort of leave with, obviously this podcast inspired by many great people's work around this concept of the spaceship Earth, particularly sort of Bucky Fuller and others. And I'm sort of always enamoured by this, this idea of, there are no passengers on this earth and we're all crew, and actually right now most of the crew that seem to be the non-humans that are kind of flying this planet right now. But I'm just curious, as I always ask a question, so right now thinking about the work you're doing with businesses particular, like what does it mean in your view to be crew right now on the spaceship Earth? How would you what's right now telling you this idea of stepping up? What does that mean to you?
Stepping up to be counted, I think it's very much this idea, and we've spoken a lot about Extinction Rebellion in this. Although nothing to do with it, I'm a complete outsider to it. I'm just a huge admirer. I've been on the sort of obviously on the marches, but not much else, unfortunately. I'd say that personal activism is what I find really fascinating, because to be an activist, again, a decade ago meant some angry person with a mask on chucking something through McDonald's window. To be an activist now is my elderly mother, or your neighbour, or us, or anyone, because people are increasingly realising that beneficial, socially aware, progressive acts have to be done on a totally personal basis, along with hopefully a societal basis. Communities where it's at, I don't want to talk about George Osborne, but we are all in this together. And I think, he jumped on a very decent saying for the wrong reasons, but I think people are increasingly realising that we're all in this together. And so, love thy neighbour is a great way to live one's life.
Nice. Thanks a lot, Sean. Good luck with the book, and we'll be in touch.
Hope so.
So I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Sean. That was a good wide-ranging chat about some pretty big stuff, just simple things like truth, global truth in a kind of world of fake, and how might we have a kind of global civilization shift in light of the ecological and climate crisis that's engulfing everything right now. Can they, my sense is, that's where I got, it sort of blows my mind, all this stuff, but, can we have one without the other? Is it possible to have that kind of civilizational response without a kind of grounding of kind of truth in our culture and society? Feels like a big ask. But anyway, who knows? We're all part of it, folks. We're all crew, right? We've all got to step up and get on with this stuff. Let's make 2020 an honest year where we just kind of like try to kind of avoid lies, where we kind of like pull people up for talking shite. Let's just not allow it to happen. It's not acceptable to have a culture where it's absolutely fine to lie and actually no one really knows anymore what's true and what's false. It's bonkers, right? Lot in there. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you're feeling all right about it. I just remembered who wrote The Empathic Civilization, which is the book I mentioned towards the end of the course, as Jeremy Rifkin. It absolutely blew my mind, this book. I picked it up about a decade ago. It's a huge book, The Empathic Civilization, and it's called The Race to Global Consciousness in a World in Crisis. And it really, worth a read. But this was sort of before, this was kind of still when we thought most people were still telling the truth. We hadn't kind of reached the kind of fake news madness that we're in now. So this added a whole new level of total complexity and head-frying madness to deal with. Anyway, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening. It means a lot. Please do share the show or give it a rating or a review if you like what you've been hearing. It really helps. Please do that. If you want to reach out, you can get me, Dan at thespaceship.earth, or on Instagram, thespaceship.earth. Sign up to the newsletter, going out once a month, updates on the podcast, other bits and pieces that are going on, and general kind of awesomeness around the shift to a more kind of regenerative, life-sustaining culture on this beautiful planet. So there you have it, folks. Hope things are good. Take it easy. Remember, there are no passengers on Spaceship Earth. We're all crew. Until next time, peace and out.